Hey everyone, welcome to Tales in Text and I'm your host Nisha and welcome to my Mahabharata readathon. Good news for those of you who are following this particular playlist. I completed volume 3 of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. So this is volume 3 and I just want to talk a bit about volume 3 like I've done with volume 1 and volume 2. I will link volume 1 and volume 2 reviews down in the description box and in the end cards if you want to check that out. Volume 3 was really interesting and it gave quite a bit of insight in terms of a lot of Hindu myths. So let's dive right in. First off, let me just take you back to volume 2 in terms of where volume 2 ended, just to give you some context of where we start ourselves at the beginning of volume 3. Volume 2 ended with the Pandavas with Draupadi in exile. We have completed around 6 years in exile at the end of volume 2. And Arjuna decides to go into the forest to do a lot of austerities and to please various gods so that he can get divine astras to use in the battle when he's battling Duryodhana and the other Kauravas. And he leaves, and volume 2 ends with the Pandavas, that is the other Pandava brothers and Draupadi, feeling really dejected and depressed because it's been ages since Arjuna left. Although the timeline doesn't honestly make sense as you're reading the story, because although technically it's supposed to be end of 6 years, around 6 years, at the end of volume 2, the exact mathematics of the timeline of the exile don't really match up, and that's something here that even Bibek Debroy does mention in one of the notes in volume 2, and I think it's in volume 3 as well that he mentions that again. That if you are trying to calculate exactly, based on whenever they say, hey, this 1 year has completed, you wouldn't end up with 13 years, you would end up with way more number of years in exile. So we're taking it at face value that it's been 6 years since the Pandavas have been in exile, and Arjuna left to do these austerities sometime midway between these 6 years. And therefore it's been quite some time, at least over a year or more, since he's gone to the mountains to worship Indra, Shiva and the other elemental deities like Agni and Varuna and so on. And the other four brothers and Draupadi are extremely dejected and they're depressed because they're missing Arjuna. They don't know whether he's safe, whether he's alive, whether he's successful or not. And they don't know when they'll be reunited with him. And so volume 2 ends with them feeling that despair, feeling that weight of having completed half of their exile, but there's still that seemingly never-ending road of 7 more years in exile that they need to spend before they can even get a chance to go and get speak to Duryodhana to get their kingdom back. That's why we leave volume 2. Then we start volume 3, which is a chunky monkey at 602 pages. This is definitely, compared to the first 3 volumes, this is the largest of the first, second and third volume, although by no means the largest in the entire series. As far as my just calculation goes, I think books 8, 9 and 10 are really huge, like more than 750 pages long. We start off volume 3 with the Tirthayatra Parva, and this is the time when we look at what the Pandavas, that is the 4 brothers, Yudhishthira, Bhima, Nakula, Sahadeva and Draupadi, were doing in the time that Arjuna was actually conducting his austerities. So how did these 4 brothers and their wife spend the time in the jungles as they were waiting for Arjuna to come back? And so that's where the Tirthayatra Parva, the very first Parva of volume 3, takes place. So Tirtha, as some of you may know, means sacred sites, and these are sites that are ancient, and even today there are a lot of places that we treat as Tirtha. For example, Pushkara is Tirtha, where Gokarna is one of the Tirthas. Ganga, the Gangetic glaciers, that's a Tirtha. These are religious sites that have that Hindus have worshipped through thousands of years. And while a large chunk, I would say, of these Tirthas are either they have disappeared, or we do not know what they are called today compared to what they were called before. Some, like for example Pushkara, like I said, they still retain the same name that was used thousands and in fact many millennia ago. So in Tirthayatra Parva, we actually come across so many tirthas that the Pandavas visited as they waited for Archana to come. In fact, if you remember, that is, if you've been following this particular playlist, a couple of months ago, I did make a video about the sacred tirthas in ancient India, and I did show you a blog post that I had written on the sacred tirthas. I will link that blog post down in the description box. And I've actually gone ahead and listed all of the tirthas in the order that is mentioned in this particular book. And in fact, in this book, they do speak of how it was in this order that people are expected to visit these tirthas. And I have mentioned that in that particular order. I've also mentioned specific tirthas that are extremely powerful and famous in different directions, north, south, east, and west. And I've also spoken about some of the tirthas which were considered exceptionally powerful, that if you were unable to visit all of the tirthas, if you visited just these handful of 4-5 tirthas, that would be enough. So I have, in that blog post, I mentioned the entire list, and that is basically what I've done. The reason I've done that is because, you know, a lot of us, including me, you know, I was completely unaware of these places, and I wasn't even sure what tirthas are even present in current day India as well. So a lot of us are not aware of these places, and it's good to kind of know about the geography of India. And in fact, I did go ahead and, as a personal project of mine, I did kind of jot down a couple of these places on the map, especially the ones that actually Vivek Debar does mention in the notes in the Tirthayatra Parva, where certain places which are still being visited as tirthas today, that have been identified as actual locations in India, current day India, he has mentioned that in the notes. So those few places I did go ahead and mark on the map, and it shows a really wonderful outline in terms of what path the Pandavas would have taken. And that does lend a lot of credence to the belief that the Mahabharata could have occurred in reality. Of course, I'm not talking about the whole Ganesha coming down and writing the Mahabharata and all the other magical elements of the epic. What I mean is the story of brothers or a family being displaced due to a fight over property, and these people visiting all of these natural sites. That, considering the presence, the geographical placement of these tirthas, I do believe that this story could be based in reality. In fact, this geographical element of the Mahabharata is what makes me believe that it could have been an actual event that, of course, took on mythic proportions over the course of many centuries. Speaking of the tirthas, like I mentioned, in fact, all of the tirthas are natural places. For example, they are either lakes, rivers, they are mountains, they are forests, they are sacred groves, they are wells, they are boulders. So there is a lot of there's a lot of reverence for natural elements, which once again, you know, reminds me that, you know, at its core, the origin of Hinduism was all about nature worship, and there wasn't a lot of Hindutva philosophy associated with it. All of this Hindutva philosophy, at least in my perspective, came significantly later. And just looking at the tirthas, you know, you realize that all of this was just about worshipping the natural elements and feeling grateful for being born on a planet which afforded us so much to eat and drink, and just the magic of nature. So the Tirthayatra Parva was definitely very interesting in terms of understanding ancient India geographically. In fact, this is the closest you would probably get to understanding how India looked like how many were 2,000, 3,000 years ago, whenever this particular story was conceptualized initially. So, and it was good to kind of understand how people would spend time and how they would travel and where they would go and what they would do at these different places. So, you know, today in these days we have our Xbox, we have our Netflix, we have our cafes and pubs to go and, you know, spend time and have fun. But in those days, you know, it was visiting these tirthas that was the fun thing to do. So it's really nice to kind of see what the ancient Indians used to do. before in terms of having fun and going to visit places and so on. So Tirthayatra Parva, major chunk, 200 pages. I do want to let you know that it does get a little boring sometimes because the descriptions are a lot. In fact, this Tirthayatra Parva actually reminded me of the second volume of the critical edition of the Ramayana, because especially when the Kishkinda Kanda, where after Sugriva gets the throne of Kishkinda, how the kind of description of the forests, and even after that when the monkeys go in search of Sita. So the descriptions of the forests were very heavy with a lot of metaphors and analogies and so on. So the Tirthayatra Parva really kind of reminded me of that again. So it does tend to get a little repetitive and boring at times, but plow through it because the next part of the book is super interesting. Right after the Tirthayatra Parva, we go through a couple of exciting chapters where a lot of action takes place. We have the Jatasura Vada Parva where Jatasura is killed. Then we have the Yakshayuddha Parva where Bhima battles Yakshas while going in search of a particular divine flower that Draupadi wants. Then we have the Ajagara Parva where Bhima gets strangled by a python, and the python agrees to release Bhima only if Yudhishthira answers a couple of dharma related questions. And of course, as usual, Yudhishthira bests the snake and therefore saves his brother's life. Then we have the Markandeya Samasya Parva, which according to me is one of the most interesting sections of this book, and it's also the largest part of this book because it narrates a lot of stories within the Mahabharata, especially the smaller stories that we actually don't really come across. So I just want to give you a quick brief and breakdown about what you actually find here in the Markandeya Samasya Parva. So here we get to learn. So Markandeya, I feel like Markandeya is like the memory keeper and the storyteller of the Hindu world, because he seems to be the one who has the most knowledge of all the ancient myths and stories from deep time. So here in this particular parva, we learn the stories of Manu, of the details about the flood. It does sound quite biblical in a way, but that's kind of like that makes it super interesting for me, because how the story of Manu and the fish and the flood kind of really reminds me of Noah's Ark and the flood in the Bible. So it kind of reminds me of how the religions are more intricately connected at their core, at their origin, than they are today. After Manu and the flood and the fish, we learn about the four yugas. So this is actually super interesting because you get the maximum information about the yugas and how the yugas play out, and what their physical embodiment and symbolic energy actually is like over here. And then we have a large section about the different kinds of fires that are considered sacred in Hinduism. So this part was a little confusing because at least according to my understanding, a large part of these fires were actually different names given to the same type of fire, or the same fire used for multiple purposes. So I've actually made a lot of notes here, but I think that would be a little too confusing for me to tell in the video. But if you do read this chapter, let me know what you think about this particular part. Then we have the stories of different both mortal and celestial beings. So we hear the story of Vamadeva, then we hear just a story of Indradyumna, then we hear the story of Dhundhumara, of story of Kaushika, story of Angiras, and that is sage Angiras, and then of Skanda, god Skanda. So all of these stories are super interesting. They're just very layered, lots of details, and in fact, if you really enjoy reading about these really nuanced information within the whole Hindu mythological landscape, I think you'll really enjoy Markandeya Samasya Parva. There are also a lot of philosophical discussions that take place over here, because through these stories, Markandeya wants to because Yudhishthira in this entire book, he seems very depressed and dejected about the direction in which his life has taken. He blames himself for what's happened because of his addiction to the gambling. They lost their kingdom, and they were sent into exile. And so throughout the duration of this volume 3, you see Yudhishthira is just always really sad, and he keeps complaining about why his fate is like this, right? And so Markandeya, through these stories, he wants to kind of remind Yudhishthira that, look, there are a lot of people who go through similar problems, but there's a lot that you can learn from their experiences, and also you can learn a lot of positive traits and positive moral lessons by learning about the lives of really important people, divine and mortal people. So Markandeya Samasya Parva has a lot about that. After this is done, or rather during the course of this time, it says there is a small parva of a few pages called Draupadi-Satyabhama Sambhada Parva. So this is essentially a conversation between Draupadi and Satyabhama, where Satyabhama actually, as any curious woman would, asks Draupadi how, Satyabhama says, I just have one husband who is Krishna, and I find it so difficult to manage him. How on earth are you successfully managing 5 different husbands? Which is a question I'm sure many of us will be having. So in that, Draupadi talks of how she behaves with the Pandavas and the kind of duties that she renders for them and how she manages the household and things like that. So it's interesting, but it's also extremely patriarchal. I do want to put that up front. So a lot of the things that Draupadi says is it's very easy to say that it's a man writing about what a woman or a wife should behave like, rather than a woman's experience of being a wife. So it is patriarchal, but it's also super interesting to hear from Draupadi, because for the large part, at least in volume 1 and volume 2, you don't really come across what Draupadi is feeling or saying. Even in important sections of the book, such as during the disrobing scene, you hear from her a little bit, but it's still, the focus is all on what the men are doing and the men are feeling and thinking. So to have an entire chapter, even if it is just like 5-6 pages long, dedicated to Draupadi and to listening to her speak, I mean, I think that's something that's really lovely, according to me, even if it is patriarchal in its nature. So after Draupadi and Satyabhama have their conversation, then we move on to the Ghosha-Yatra Parva, where our resident bully Duryodhana I actually do like him. I'm not gonna lie. I do like Duryodhana. I don't honestly feel like the Kauravas are actually all that bad, and they do have a rightful claim to the kingdom if you actually think about it, because officially Dhritarashtra, if he wasn't blind, he would have got the kingdom, and therefore by default afterwards Duryodhana would have got the kingdom. So he was shortchanged because of the rules of that time. But yeah, sure. So our resident bully, who gives me a lot of mixed feelings, so he decides that it would be great fun to go and kind of poke fun at his cousins by taking a huge retinue with all his riches and just going and flaunting all of his riches and his wealth in front of the poor Pandavas. So he sets up a ruse saying that I'm going to go look at the cow stations where all the cows of the kingdom are, they're kind of put together, and I'm going to meet the cow herds to make sure that the cows are treated well. And using that excuse, he goes along with his huge army and his followers and all the riches, just to kind of poke fun at the Pandavas, to show them that, hey, look at me and look at you, kind of a thing. And unfortunately for him, his plan backfires, because Chitrasena and his army of Gandharvas capture Duryodhana and his gang, and it ends up that ultimately the Pandavas go rescue Duryodhana and free him from the clutches of the Gandharvas, and we have a very shamefaced Duryodhana basically crying about how his manliness has been destroyed, and how suicide is now the only way for him to make sure that he remains honorable, because his enemies, his greatest enemies, the Pandavas, have saved his life, and that he just cannot permit this to happen. And then we have Karna and Shakuni and coming in and talking sense in terms of how just because they saved your life doesn't mean you need to kill yourself. If you truly want to do something good for them, how about you return the kingdom to them? Interestingly, Shakuni is always shown as someone who's being really mean and nasty, and just someone who's like downright evil to the core. But he is the one who actually suggests to Duryodhana that if you're genuinely feeling ashamed about the situation, about what happened to you, and you're feeling grateful to the Pandavas for saving your life, then ask them to end the exile and return their share of the kingdom to them, and we can just put everything behind us. That is what Shakuni says. So it's something that's really interesting, because this is a fact that not a lot of people actually mention when they're talking about Shakuni as a character and his place in the Mahabharata, that he did have his generous moments no matter how bad he was as a person. So then what happens is the Daityas and the Danavas kind of meet Duryodhana on a subconscious level, where they basically tell him that he is their representative, and he's been destined to fulfill their wishes of overthrowing the gods who are represented by the Pandavas, and so therefore he cannot kill himself. He will not be allowed to do it because he owes the divine world something else. So his mortal wishes come second. So ultimately, Duryodhana decides, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna go back home and just recoup, and let's just put this behind us. I won't do anything drastic. Then we have, right after this, we have a very small parva called the Mriga Swapna Bhaya Parva. And I really like this. This is a 2-page chapter, which where basically a deer comes to Yudhishthira in a dream and begs him to leave the forest and go to another place, because the Pandavas have hunted all the deers to near extinction in that forest, and the deer begs Yudhishthira that, hey, give us a chance to have our children and to get our forest back, get our numbers back on track, because you know, you've basically destroyed our entire species to such an extent that we're almost going to go extinct. And Yudhishthira feels very sorry, because as a king, he is supposed to look after not just the humans but other creatures as well. And so then he and his brothers move to a different forest. So I really liked the fact that they actually, the writers of this of the Mahabharata actually took the time to pen down the fears of a deer. It really speaks volumes about the ecocentricness of Hinduism in ancient times, where we lived with the land and just not in the form of, you know, exploiting the resources. So we took care to make sure that we allowed nature to regenerate before we came back for something else. So I really like that ecocentricity over here, and I really appreciate them adding this particular chapter. So after this, we move to the Vrihid Raunika Parva, where we hear the story of Mudgala and his generosity, in fact. And I actually really liked Mudgala's story, and that is something I feel like the way Mudgala treats the offer of going to heaven is something that's very refreshing, because otherwise you see how in other myths, if there's anyone who's offered a chance to go to heaven, especially in the physical body, they would just jump at that chance. But Mudgala is super practical minded, and he says, you know, I want to know the pros and cons of going to heaven. And that's something that I've not actually come across in either in the Ramayana or in these 3 volumes up until now. So it was nice to see, because this particular chapter also has the cons of living in heaven. So, you know, we'd assume that being in heaven means something always positive, but that's not really the case. Here, Mudgala's story shows us that there are quite a few negatives of being a denizen of heaven. So that was super interesting. Then we have another large chapter called Draupadi Harana Parva, where Draupadi is kidnapped by Jayadratha. So this kind of has a lot of parallels with the Ramayana. And in fact, the Ramayana is narrated in a couple of sub-chapters within the Draupadi Harana Parva. This chapter, I would say, is one of those pivotal moments that you can see the consequences of later on in the war, because in this chapter, Bhima and Arjuna, they basically shave Jayadratha after, you know, freeing Draupadi and capturing Jayadratha, and then they beat him black and blue, and they just kind of throw him out and say that, you know what, you can go back home shamefaced. We are giving you we are having the grace to set you free. And it is this experience, I believe, which leads to the shame and anger that Jayadratha feels, which ultimately destroys the life of Abhimanyu later in the war. So the story of Abhimanyu, of course, is still much ahead, so we don't know how that honestly plays out in the critical edition. But if you were to look at the popular editions, it is Jayadratha who stops the Pandavas from entering the Chakravyuha to save Abhimanyu's life when he's gone inside, and that's what ends up being the one thing where basically Abhimanyu dies. So you can actually see that this is one of those pivotal chapters which you know is going to really backfire on the Pandavas in such a terrible way, and it kind of gives you the shivers. Coming back to the Ramayana part, so after the abduction is done and Draupadi is saved, Markandeya, once again our resident storyteller, comes back and narrates the story of Ramayana to Yudhishthira to basically because Yudhishthira is upset that, why do these bad things keep happening to him, and why do these bad things keep happening to his wife, although she is so devoted to dharma. And so Markandeya tells the story of the Ramayana to show that, Sita was also the follower of dharma, Rama was also a follower of dharma, but the similar kind of situation of abduction and war did happen to them as well. Then we also get to learn the story of Savitri and Satyavan, because the Ramayana is a story of a husband saving his wife. And yes, I'm not talking about the Uttarakanda at all, because that kind of that shows a different facet to the post Ramayana story. But what I am talking about is that from just a very superficial lens, the Ramayana is of a husband saving his wife. Savitri and Satyavan's story, on the other hand, is of a wife saving her husband from the claws of death. So Savitri and Satyavan, just as a for context, Satyavan is doomed to have a very short life, and Yama comes to collect his soul. Savitri follows Yama wherever he goes, refusing to leave her husband's side, and she answers a lot of the questions related to dharma. And because Yama is the king of dharma, right? He's the personification of dharma. And so Yama is so pleased with her answers that he gives her multiple boons, including the boon of getting her husband back to life. And then Savitri and Satyavan lead a very happy life for 400 years and have hundreds of sons. So we get to hear both of these stories, and they are also super interesting, very nice to know. And Savitri's story in particular, is kind of one of those stories which show that, because if you look at the epics in general, they don't really shine a very positive light on the women. Either they're scheming like Kaikeyi, for example, in the Ramayana, or they are considered to be just temptresses. Like, for example, Tilottama was considered a temptress, although she was not, it wasn't her choice, it wasn't her agency, right? So you have a lot of these instances where women are always shown as being the reason for conflict. For example, Draupadi is considered to be one of the reasons for conflict between the Pandavas and Kauravas. So and also you don't see a lot of women being given center stage where they actually display their knowledge of dharma. And I'm not just talking about the dharma of being a good wife and good mother according to a patriarchal sense. I'm talking about real philosophical knowledge, a grasp on the complicated philosophical concepts. So Savitri has that grasp of complicated philosophical concepts, which she showcases and impresses Yama when she answers his questions. So this particular chapter is super interesting as well. Then we come to the Kundala Aharana Parva, which is the very sad chapter of when Karna gives away his Kavacha and Kundalas to Indra. During this part, we come to know of Karna's birth story, although he himself doesn't come to know, because this is something that just Vaishampayana tells Janamejaya, but Karna still doesn't know his origin story. And honestly speaking, I feel like people don't really talk of Karna's origin story with the authenticity it deserves. And what I mean is, they make it seem as though Pritha, that is Kunti, she wanted to have a child by the sun, and therefore she calls him, and then she gets worried that, oh hey, by the way, I'm unmarried, so I probably should not have done this. But it's okay, you know what, both of them are happy, both of them like each other, so they decide to just have a baby. Honestly speaking, this is the version that I've heard like most of my life, right, growing up. But the reality is that Surya comes off as a bully, he comes off as a pedophile, because honestly, Kunti is like 10 years old or younger than 10 years old at the time. And I know the culture of India has come from this stage where, girls are married off really young, so a girl married off at 10 wasn't something super strange or weird in ancient times. Yet it comes off super strange because this is a god who's lived for like millions of years supposedly, right? And you have this child, and he's basically browbeating her and bullying her and threatening her by saying that if you don't let me use your body, right, if you don't let me impregnate you right now, then I am going to curse your father, I'm going to curse Durvasa who gave you the gift of this mantra, and I'm going to curse the entire world, and it will be your fault, and you will be the reason for the destruction of the entire world. So he basically threatens a grown-ass man, threatens a child to sleep with him, and even though she begs him, he says that I don't give a shit about what you're saying. I don't care about your feelings. So just lie down on the bed. So this is basically it, right? Like I was just appalled with the nature of how Surya spoke, because we don't actually hear such a, this person's Surya actually talking in this way. Because I have never come across that in any of the other books that I have read. And just that anger and that kind of and the negative passion with which he kind of assaults Prita with, both emotionally, verbally, and even physically, because after their intercourse, it is so hard for her to bear, so rough that she falls down unconscious, right? So it kind of again talks of the brutalization of her body. And it just kind of like, this particular chapter, along with Draupadi Harana chapter, really kind of, it made me really sad, because it was how normalized it was to see men threatening women, men browbeating women, and just making, just getting their way with women by using both physical force and verbal force. It's a very sad situation, and you can see why there is such an high incidence of crimes against women and women identifying people in India, because these books actually have a lot of evidence of how it is so normalized, how sexual assault is normalized, how pedophilia is normalized, right? So it's a little sad in that way. And so we end with the final parva after Karna gives away his Kavacha Kundala. We go to the Araneya Parva, where this is the iconic scene where the four younger brothers, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, Sahadeva, encounter Dharma in the form of a yaksha. And they are unable to answer any questions that Dharma poses, and therefore they fall down dead. And Yudhishthira comes and finds the bodies of his brothers, and he agrees to answer Dharma's questions. And when Dharma is pleased, he says, which brother do you want me to resuscitate, or reanimate rather? And he says, I want Nakula, because for me both Madri and Kunti are equal in terms of mothers. So I want a son from Madri to be alive, because I am the son of Kunti and I am alive too. So seeing Yudhishthira's generosity, that he chose a stepbrother and not a brother by blood, Dharma is extremely pleased with his reasoning, and so he brings all the Pandavas back to life. And so then we come to the end of the Araneya Parva, which ultimately ends the Aranyaka Parva as a whole, because Aranyaka Parva is one of the most massive Parvas, which started in, I think, even volume 2. And the entirety of volume 2 and volume 3 comes under Aranyaka Parva, like not entirety, but like the largest part of it comes under Aranyaka Parva. And we end with the Pandavas and Draupadi having completed 12 years in exile, and now the 13th year is pending, and the 13th year is supposed to be spent incognito, where they basically have to be living for a whole year without being recognized as being the Pandavas and Draupadi. So Dharma tells Yudhishthira that go to Virata's kingdom, because that's where you can hide the best. And so we end volume 3 with the Pandavas and Draupadi sitting and discussing what exactly should we do, how should we dress, where should we live, so that we can complete this 13th year, this final year of exile in incognito. So that is where we end Aranyaka Parva. We also end volume 3 of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. So overall, this book has been super interesting. The first 200 pages of Tirthayatra Parva were definitely really long and drawn out. But after that, the book started taking, going full steam ahead. I'm really enjoying it so far. We have come to volume 4, and I just want to introduce you to volume 4. This is the book that I will be reading. And volume 4 essentially has, let me just read out the description of volume 4. Which is there at the last part of the book. So the fourth part of the volume talks of the Pandavas' life in King Virata's kingdom for 1 year. Then the cattle raid and the battle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, which ultimately gets the Pandavas found out. But luckily for them, the exile has already ended, so they don't have to worry too much. Then then the discussions between the Pandavas and the Kauravas happened, where the Pandavas request the Kauravas to return their kingdom, but the Kauravas say no. Krishna tries to to intervene to stop the war, but Duryodhana is hell bent on having the war. And then the Udyoga Parva starts in volume 4. So Virata Parva and the Udyoga Parva are the two major parvas that take place in volume 4. And Udyoga Parva is basically the preparations that both sides do to commence the war. And according to the descriptions in this book, we start off with Bhishma's Parva, looking at how Bhishma led the war, and a small portion of Drona's Parva as well, or that is after Bhishma's death, what happens. And so the war by itself, I believe, based on the descriptions given in the back, is there only the final few chapters, final few parvas of this book, with the major chunk of this book being the preparation towards war. And from book 5 onwards, volume 5 onwards, we'll be jumping right into the heart of the war. And I believe that, I think volume 5 and volume 6 both, perhaps even volume 7, I am not 100% sure, but I think the next 2 or 3 volumes are only about the war. So yeah, we are getting there. The drums are, we can hear the drums sounding. The war is almost upon us. So yeah, I can't wait to meet you once I read this book and once I review this book. So yeah, if you have watched this video so far, thank you so much for watching. Yeah, I will see you in my next episode of the Mahabharata Readathon series. Bye bye, have a wonderful day.